Good morning, afternoon, or evening, folks, and welcome to Cast of All Trades, the show where we talk about developing skills, exploring ideas, and following curiosity. I'm your host, Orion Siebert, and in this episode, I talk about silversmithing and how you can start today. I started silversmithing back in college, where I taught myself over the span of a month how to create jewelry, ultimately so I can make a ring for my friend's birthday. In this episode, you'll learn about the general process it takes to start silversmithing, the tools and materials I recommend for beginner silversmiths, recommended projects to get you started, and much more. Silversmithing is one of my favorite skills I've developed by far over the years, and one that I've become somewhat well known for amongst my friends. If you want to learn more about the skills I've developed and get my shortcuts for getting good faster, then make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on more episodes like this. I believe that about covers it. So, without further ado, welcome to Silversmithing 101. Here's how I'm going to structure this episode. I'm going to start off by discussing what silversmithing is and a little bit of the history behind it, how you get started and the general process of silversmithing. Then I'm going to go into some of the skills that will help you in your silversmithing, what are some cost-saving methods, and potentially offering a path for you beyond just silversmithing 101. And finally ending off with some resources I recommend that will help you develop as a silversmith. So starting off with, what is silversmithing? As the name implies, silversmithing is the art of crafting goods out of silver, but historically, this would mean much larger items, such as candlesticks, flatware, dishes, etc. These are going to be things that you're handling day to day. That's what historically silversmiths would do. That said, we're mostly going to be talking about silversmithing from the perspective of jewelry making. Historically, gold was much more commonly used to make jewelry than silver was, but there were certainly cases of it in antiquity. But we're going to be focusing more on silver instead of gold. So, how are we going to get started with silversmithing? First off, you're going to be choosing your first project. For this, you're going to start off by choosing a project that you believe will be something simple to do. For this, I recommend something that I call wireframe projects. These are projects that can be done exclusively using silver wire as your base material. Examples of this could be a wire wrap accessory or simple rings, pendants, stone settings, etc. For me, my very first project, even before I started silversmithing, but is one that I would definitely recommend for aspiring silversmiths, was to make a set of copper elf ear accessories where they're essentially a pair of elf ears that you could slide over your ears that had a little fun accessory sense to them. But what that helped me do was it helped me learn how to bend and wrap copper wire into specific shapes, something that you'll be commonly doing as a silversmith. But my first real silversmithing project, as I mentioned before, was making a ring as a birthday gift for a friend. And to practice for that, I made a little ring for myself in a similar pattern. And I still have that ring to this day, and it's my go-to ring if I ever want to wear jewelry around. So with that in mind, what are my recommended go-to projects for the beginner silversmith? I have 5 that immediately come to mind. 1, the elf ears, as I just recommended. They're very simple. The only skill that you really need to do with them is you just got to learn how to bend wires. It's not too hard. It gets you a good idea of what it's like to work with these metals by hand, and just a good baseline project. One step above that would be making rings, as in simple wire bands. This is also going to involve some basic wire bending, but also introduce you to silver soldering. So it's a good beginner project to get you one step above the elf ears. Next, for a little extra complexity, I would work on stone settings, where that's going to be more of the same of wire bending, except you're also going to be adding designing crowns. The crown is the piece of metal that wraps around the stone that clamps it in place. So you'll be learning how to do basic designs to come up with these crown ideas. You'll be doing some metal filing, some fine detail work, and working on your minute strength is what I'm going to call it, or the ability to use a lot of strength to make a very small movement in a very careful way. Another similar project, sort of building on that, is making pendants, especially pendants that have stone settings in them. These are going to be much more difficult than doing rings or just stone settings because pendants in particular, especially if you're working on something very small, you're going to be learning a lot about silver soldering and how to do that properly. Because if you're working with something so small, you're going to make a lot of mistakes of silver soldering in there, and you might solder one thing and accidentally desolder another thing. So a lot of lessons to be learned there. And finally, for a bit of a bigger project, something that would be more along the lines of actual traditional silversmithing, would be actually a tiara or some little crown, something like that. This is definitely a bigger project. It is kind of similar to the elf ears in a way, where it gives you a chance to work on your wire bending skills, but also it gives you a chance to just incorporate some more fanciful designs in there. So those are the 5 main projects I would recommend for beginner silversmiths to look at, to consider, to look through. But of course, if you have any other silver project ideas that you want to go, just go and focus on that. Do those. But once you have your first project picked out, next is moving on to researching the process. Once you have your project in mind, do a bit of research to see how it's done. For silversmithing, I favor YouTube tutorials to get an idea of what to do. That said, I'd never blatantly copy a tutorial for myself for the project. The goal is just to get a loose, general idea of what this project is going to look like for you. So watch a couple tutorials. For example, if you're interested in doing a wire wrap ring or interested in doing a wire braided ring, then go watch a couple tutorials, see how different people do it. Then of that, decide, okay, I like how this person does this, I like how this person does that, and then piece that together a little bit on your own to say, I'm going to take all these pieces that I learned and put it into my own project and write out a rough, very rough process list for yourself of first I'll do this, then this, then this, then this. Just a simple blueprint. You don't have to follow through on it, but just getting that rough idea of this is how I would presumably go about this project. Next, based on that simple design, based on that simple step-by-step, you're going to be actually designing your end product. Really make the project your own. What do you want the end product to look like? For me, this typically involves blueprinting. It involves taking some notebook paper or some scraps of paper, taking a pencil, just trying to draw out that end product as best as I can. This will also help if you're trying to do, say, one of the wire bending projects, where you can really get some fine, minute details in there of, I want these exact swoops, or I want these exact crossovers of certain sections. And with that, you can essentially create a little blueprint where you can bend wires right on top of it to get an exact match of what you're looking for. Really do not discount this designing the end product phase, designing the end product step, because without it, it can be very easy to flounder and waste a lot of materials if you're not sure what you're trying to end up at. Next is finally getting the tools and getting the materials. Of course, you can do this anytime before this, but I recommend just getting an idea of what you're trying to do before you get your hands on the materials themselves. So, what are the tools I'm going to be recommending here? Starting off with the materials, there are 5 main materials I'm going to recommend that you look at picking up. There's going to be sterling silver, wire of various gauges. There's silver solder. There's precious stones. If you're working on stone setting stuff, I'll provide a resource at the very end of this podcast episode about where you can go and get some pretty good stones. Then, to round out this materials list, I'd recommend picking up some brass wire and some copper wire of various gauges. I'll answer why I'm adding these on the list a little bit later. For the actual tools, here is your shopping list. Not all these tools are necessarily required, but these are the tools that I used in the beginning that I continue to use to this day when I'm going to be doing silversmithing stuff. This is why I consider generally the essentials, but you can get away with not having some of these if you have alternatives or if you're getting creative. So, what is my tools list? You've got your butane torch, you've got your fire brick / your soldering brick, you have silver soldering flux, you have various sets of pliers and various sets of snips. There's a couple different designs you can go for with this. But you don't need anything too complex to begin with. You're going to want a rubber mallet and a metal mallet. These will be helpful for you as you're shaping your metal. You're going to want an anvil or something nice and heavy, preferably iron or steel or something hard to hammer your piece against. You're going to want a jar, some vinegar / cleaning acid. Vinegar works just fine, any kind you can get. A Dremel with a polishing bit, or generally with a wide variety of bits that can be very helpful for this. A jeweler's saw, a brush, some tweezers, ring sizers, a ring mandrel, and finally some mini metal files. All of these are relatively easy to get, easy access on Amazon. That's where I got most of my tools. Either that, or you can always go to your local hardware store, and they should have 99% of whatever you need there. If they don't have it there, well, I'd honestly be very shocked. Maybe consider a craft store after that. But generally, these are the tools I would recommend for any beginners just starting to get into silversmithing. Nothing all that complicated. you're going to be learning how to use these tools on the job as you're actually making your project. So nothing you really need to know upfront, but certainly having some knowledge of it beforehand will be helpful. Once you have your tools in hand, what are you going to be doing next? Some people might dive straight into working on their silver, trying to make their project. No, pause, wait, do not do that. You don't want to dive in and instantly waste a bunch of kind of expensive material. Silver isn't the cheapest around, and that's why we have the brass and the copper. You're going to want to practice, practice, practice. Start by using the brass and copper to really work on building up your skills. Brass wire is great for shaping and designing, coming up with like larger designs, and practicing actually working with the metal on hand. Copper, on the other hand, is great to practice soldering. The way it reacts to the butane torch is much more similar to the sterling silver than the brass is going to be, and you can easily ruin a bunch of brass by trying to silver solder it. So what I would recommend is either just use copper for all of your practice material, or use brass for some of your practice and use copper for some of your soldering practice. Brass for shaping, copper for soldering. Make a couple test pieces, get comfortable with the basics of bending, cutting, shaping, soldering, and maybe even try to make some good, accurate prototype pieces of what you want your final design to be like. This can also inform you of, hey, maybe this design that I was going for originally isn't actually going to work out all that well. Then you can go and change your design, find something else that suits it, that fits a little bit better, and that will work better for you. And that way you haven't wasted a bunch of very expensive materials, you just used a bunch of lightweight, cheap, kind of knockoff practice material. As always, one of the best things you can do is practice, practice, practice. But once you're finally feeling good about your skills, it's time to move on and take that practice into actually starting the project. Take the skills that you developed and start on your main project. You're going to want to just do your best, take your time, and go slow. Look at the step-by-step process that you put together earlier. Figure out, okay, if I'm going to be making a ring, I should probably start off with figure out what size it's going to be. Then work your way down to figure out how much wire you're going to use for that. Again, there's going to be a bit of experimenting in this. There's always a little bit of experimenting. Just get used to it, practice. You're going to make mistakes. Don't worry about it. Just live, learn, write out what mistakes you make, and try again. When I was starting my very first project, making my first rings, I ended up making 3 copper rings before I tried making my first silver ring. And the first copper ring was horrible, absolutely horrible. The second copper ring, it's a little bit better. I started to learn, I started to figure out, okay, this is what it's like to actually bend wire into the shape that I want it to. I learned how to use more of my tools, and I learned how to use them in conjunction with each other to make a better final product. And finally, with the last copper ring, I put that together, I practiced basically every single step of the process that I'd written out to make my very first ring, my first silver ring. I cut the rings to size, I bent the wires in the proper way that I wanted them to go to, I joined them together, I did a proper soldering job on it, I cleaned it, I polished it at the very end, and it looked great. It was a wonderful, very wonderful job, and it made me feel extra confident in moving into my actual silversmithing first project. With that, I was able to take the same design, the same everything, the same steps that I did, making my first copper ring, and apply it to my first silver ring. And looking at my first silver ring now, it's really dang good. You can only see one minor mistake in there, where you can find the solder joint that I made on it very faintly. Like, if you don't know where it is, you probably wouldn't even notice it. That's what practice and preparation can do for you. You get the jitters out, and you actually are able to sit down and work on your project bit by bit by bit. My first silver ring probably took me I want to say it took me maybe 2 days for me to do it, because I want to take every step very, very slow. There's no point in rushing it. The point of silversmithing is to come out with a good product, so why would you rush it and ruin the product partway through? So you've started your project, you've gotten to a point where you feel good about it. You say, awesome, this is exactly what I want it to be. As you're going through and designing and working on and making your product, you're also going to be thinking about cleaning your project. You're going to want to take some time in between your silver soldering sessions to actually properly clean the project. A lot of people recommend using a pickling crock pot with some pickling acid to clean it. That's good and all, but you don't really need that. For me, what I used a jar with some vinegar and some other acids placed in it, and a pot of boiling water. Essentially, what I ended up doing was a very similar process to canning food, where I would load the jar up with the cleaning acids. I would drop my piece in after doing a bunch of soldering, and it was very dirty from either ash or from slag or from other stuff that ended up bubbling up to the surface as I was soldering these joints together. I would plop my little ring in at the end of the night. I would throw that in the acid. I would close it. We'll close up the jar, put it in a pot of water, start boiling it, and that would essentially add on pressure, creating essentially a little pressure cooker there. I didn't want to get it to be too pressurized, so I had to carefully monitor it for a little bit. I would cook it for maybe like 10, 15 minutes, take it out, put it in the fridge, leave it there overnight. And bright side of that is that I would always get weird questions from my roommates at the time saying, what smells so good? And I could always tell them that they were smelling cleaning acid for silversmithing, so that was always a fun time. Tangent aside, generally you want to clean your piece regularly after soldering it. That just gives you a better project to work with over time as you're soldering more joints. You just get a better idea of what the end product is going to look like. So regularly clean your piece, especially as you're going through and soldering at each and every joint. Next, you finally have a pretty finished product. So you have all your silver done there. If you're going to set stones, you're going to have to wait to set your stones until the very end once you're done with all of your soldering. The general finishing process for any project will go like this. You're going to set your final stones, you're going to sand and file down any sharp edges on there, and you're going to prepare for polishing. And you finally get to the polishing phase, where it finally comes together and you get one very beautiful piece. This is the general polishing process for you. You're going to wash off your piece, you're going to dry it, you're going to put on some gloves, you're going to apply a jewelry polishing compound to your Dremel's polishing wheel. Next, you're going to polish the project to a nice shine. If it's a ring, make sure to polish the inside and the outside of it. Really get into each nook and cranny of the ring. Once you do that, it's going to take some time. Be slow, be careful. Feel free to use a liberal amount of polishing compound with it. Once you feel good about it, say, that looks beautiful, that's stunning, that's a mirror-like reflection, go ahead and turn off your Dremel, turn off your polishing tools, go wash your piece one more time, dry it off, and enjoy. You have a beautifully polished, well-done first silver piece. So, with all that in mind, that was a very quick rush-through explanation of what silversmithing is and how you can do it. What are some skills that I recommend that I can see that really help in the silversmithing process? There are a couple skills that come to mind that I think, yes, that's definitely going to give you an edge when you're starting this off. First is design and drawing. This can be as simple as being able to think out your projects in your head, to be able to really get a good image in your mind to say, okay, this is exactly what it's going to look like. I'm going to do twists here, going to do bends here. This is where I'm going to solder it. While not entirely necessary, it certainly helps plan out complex designs. Drawing in particular can be very, very helpful with this. Definitely, as I've been going through and working on various rings throughout my time as a silversmith, I drew and drew and drew tons of different pictures of rings, tons of different designs, tons of different bends and soldering joints. And through that, I was able to work out certain problems that I would have run into had I not been able to draw these out. I was able to figure out some interesting solder joints that I wasn't planning on doing originally to say, okay, if I want a design sort of looking like this, I should be able to wrap certain aspects of the ring around each other to get those joints soldered in nicely. Drawing by far saved me countless hours, most definitely, of trying to do stupid, minute details that weren't going to work, because I was able to work them out on paper before I tried working them out in person. Next is going to be a steady hand. You'll develop this over time eventually as you work with silversmithing, but a steady hand will definitely help you with the fine detail work, such as soldering, bending, shaping, etc. And as part of having a steady hand, it's also having the ability of minute strength is what I call it, or the ability to bend and manipulate metal on a very small and delicate scale. And being able to apply a lot of controlled strength to make those fine adjustments is sometimes very painful. You're going to be learning a lot about leverage in this because you don't want to be trying to essentially put 25 to 30 pounds of force into trying to make one tiny bend only to push a little bit too hard and just snap the solder joint off. Whereas if you were able to get a nice leverage point on there, that you would only have to do like a simple squeeze of the hand when you're holding some pliers or something to get a nice round bend. So definitely a steady hand and some knowledge of leverage. Very, very helpful. I would not discount that. Next is going to be having an eye for detail. Similar to the drawing and design, having an eye for detail, being able to identify these small details, the mistakes, where things are likely going to go wrong, those can be very helpful for you as you're planning and plotting out and figuring out in person or in action of how am I going to solve this thing. Especially since silversmithing is, especially in this context of jewelry making, is almost always done on such a small, detailed scale. An eye for detail is necessary and something you will develop over time as you work on silversmithing. Next, and probably one of the most irritating skills that is very helpful to have in silversmithing, is soldering, and silver soldering in particular, because you don't want to waste your silver solder, and you don't want to use too much. You don't want to use too little. You use too little, your solder joints aren't going to stick very well, and they're likely going to break. You use too much, you ruin the purity of the silver even more than it has to be. It just doesn't look good. So it's finding that right balance point of not having too much silver, but also not having way too much on there. Not only that, it's also difficult to learn how much heat to apply to certain sections of the jewelry, especially when you're working on very small areas where you're going to have many silver soldering joints all done together. For example, I was working on a pendant, and pendants are irritating as hell sometimes to get a good solder done on them, especially if you're trying to mount a stone to it, because typically when you're designing a crown, you want to have anywhere between 3 and 4 prongs to hold down the stone on it for standard crowns. But if you're working with really small stones and you're trying to solder those 3 prongs to that crown, there's a decent chance that you can solder one on, then you can try to solder on the second one, and then the first one will come off, or you solder 2 on, and then you try to get the third on, and the first 2 will come off. It's just a matter of trying to figure out how do you control the heat properly, how can you distribute it evenly, how can you balance the amount of the silver solder, the flux, everything to try to get everything to play nicely and stick together well. It's annoying, it's painful, but it's a very helpful skill that will save you a lot of time and a lot of headache if you can slowly learn and develop silver soldering beforehand. This is what copper practice is great for. Practicing on copper, wonderful. Get all the silver solder you want all over that, but when you're working on silver, you ideally want to use as little silver solder as you absolutely necessarily have to. As an additional part to the heating process, if you hold the torch too closely or if you apply too much heat, you risk melting your ring or your piece altogether. So it's this whole big balancing act of getting just enough heat and just enough solder and just enough flux to be able to get all of your silver solder joints just right on there. In a similar vein to using your torch, basic tools. You're going to want to be able to know how to use each and every one of your basic tools. This is going to include Dremels, files, jeweler's saws, pliers, snips, etc. I'm going to go into each of these a little bit of what you might want to use each of these tools for. For your Dremel, you're going to want to use that for the sanding bits and for the polishing wheel. Dremels generally aren't that complicated to use, so I don't feel like I have to go all that in depth on how to use it. But generally, just be careful, steady hand, slow and steady wins the race. Don't take off too much metal, because you can always take more off, but you can't put more back on. Next, going over the files. Ideally, you get a mini file set that has a number of different types of files on there, a number of different shapes. The main ones that I use most frequently would be a triangle file, a round file, a square file, a sort of rectangle flat edge file, and I want to say maybe one more in there. You're going to use all different sorts of files, just because for various projects, you're going to want to get into every single edge, corner, whatever, to get just the right shape on your project, and files are a perfect way to do that. Again, take this slow. You can always take off more material, but you can't put more back on. For the jeweler's saw, this doesn't really require all that much skill, but it takes a lot of patience, and you have to have some level of skill so you don't accidentally break the saw blades. Jeweler's saw blades are very fine, and they can be very delicate. So just learning how to do so carefully and to cut carefully with them, great. It'll take a little bit of time. I have broken, I think, 1 or 2 jeweler's saw blades in my time. Typically, more often, I will actually just run the blades down so much that I have to replace the blades. So it's not too difficult to use them once you get the hang of it, but you'll probably break a blade or 2 over time as you work on it, as you try to practice jeweler's saw, like using your jeweler's saw for the first time. Pliers. For sure, this is the main one. You're going to want to learn how to get leverage on certain aspects of it, especially if you're making nice bends. For example, when you're trying to set stones, setting stones in rings can be very painful if you don't have a good leverage point. I like using pliers to push down on the prongs to really get a good grip on the stone. And if I don't have a good leverage point there, it can be very difficult for me to actually move those prongs without breaking them or snapping them off. So learning how to use your pliers effectively to get a good leverage point, to be able to bend those prongs over, to get a good grip on the stone, that's very important. Not only that, but being able to use your pliers to either manipulate or bend the metal in other ways, also very helpful. Just learning how to use them effectively to apply a lot of leverage, to get a lot of strength to it, while at the same time having very fine motor controls while still using pliers. Snips, in a similar vein to jeweler's saws and Dremels and files and all that, this is just cutting away more material and knowing when to use certain types of snips. Sometimes you're going to want to use horizontal clips or vertical snips. There's a bunch of different types. Just pick up one or two. It doesn't have to get all that complicated. Just know how to use them, know how to not accidentally cut yourself with it. One little tip I'd say when using snips is to try to cover the entire ring with your hand, like cover the ring and the head of the snips with one hand and use the snips with the other. Because oftentimes when you're actually cutting materials, there's a decent chance they'll send something flying. So you just want to make sure you have one hand covering everything so you can catch anything so it doesn't go flying off. Finally, in general, just learn how to both use the tools at your disposal and to know which tools you should be using at any given point in time. Yes, you can experiment, you can jerry rig, you can do whatever. I've certainly done that a lot, and I've ended up making my own tools sometimes to get a certain job done. But if you have the right tool for the job, use the right tool for the job and learn when to identify, I should probably use this tool over this one. Don't get so attached to say, I have to use the Dremel for everything. Just don't. I know people like that. Just don't be like that. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some cost-saving methods, because if you want to get into silversmithing, you also don't want to spend an arm and a leg getting into it. So for the tools and materials that I already recommended, that'll probably cost you anywhere between like $100 to $150, just based on what you already have on hand and based on the current price of silver and copper and brass at the time, because that's always going to be fluctuating. Can't give you an exact price on that, but generally, you shouldn't have to spend more than $100 to $150 on it. As for some actual cost-saving methods, 1. Save the scrap silver that you cut. This can always be used later on for metal casting or even to sell. It may not amount to much, but there are a number of businesses that buy scrap precious metals for melting them down later, or you can keep it to save it to melt it down on your own when you ultimately decide to move on to a path forward of casting and creating your own silver from scratch. Next is to use what you have available on hand and learn to be scrappy. As I just mentioned, there are a number of tools that you can choose to buy, but you can also just make jerry-rigged versions of them. For example, I made a custom wooden dowel ring sizer thing where I can essentially clamp down my ring into it so I can work on that. I can get a better grip on it with one hand and I can work on it with the other. So that was one interesting tool that I made on my own that worked well for silversmithing. If there's a tool that you really need, honestly, I'd still just consider getting scrappy before going out and buying something new. Just see what you have on hand, see what you can put together. Besides, it's kind of fun to make your own tools for doing your own stuff. I know a number of people who make their own tools for blacksmithing. I don't see why the same can't be said for silversmithing. Finally, math is your friend. Math is great, especially when you're prototyping and practicing. Practice with cheap materials before you use the expensive materials. And always, as you're prototyping and practicing, track the lengths of your wire that you're using in your practice pieces so you can get exact lengths for your final product. I was semi-recently making a tiara, and I made a prototype out of brass, and as I was doing that, I ended up measuring out every single strand that I cut, so that once I moved on to the silver version, I had the exact measurements lined out, so I knew exactly how much silver I'll be using in each single run, and helped me save so much money from so much experimentation that I would have had to do with the silver that I ended up doing with the brass. So math is definitely your friend here. Don't skimp on the math. As always, measure twice, cut once. It's better than measuring once and having to cut 2, 3, 4 times, only to have to go back and do it all over again. So those are my major tips for getting started with silversmithing. It's not all that complicated, really, and it just takes a little bit of effort and some determination to say, I want to go and do this thing. So what's the path forward? What are going to be the extra tools, the extra whatever, if you want to move on from Silversmithing 101 to Silversmithing 102? For that, you're going to be looking more at getting a high-power propane torch, a crucible, casting equipment, and finer detail Dremel and power tools to be able to get those fine detail stuff on more complex and detailed rings. And who knows, maybe you'd step up your game from silver to platinum or from silver to gold, something like that. But finally, I'm going to be recommending a couple resources for what you can use to really get your hands on learning silversmithing. So what would I recommend most of all? As always, probably YouTube. YouTube is the best place to learn basically anything. So if you want to learn silversmithing, go to YouTube, pick out a couple different tutorials on how to do certain things, how to make rings, how to make other jewelry, how to do certain aspects of things, how to get a good silver soldering joint, how to make a crown. Really, you can look up any of this on YouTube, get a good video, get a good tutorial, and go forward with that. Next is a set of resources that I have for getting good gemstones for your stone settings. The first is if you're a cheapskate like me, go for walks and just pay attention to the ground because you never know what you find. You can find some very lovely agates, some very lovely stones, very lovely things you can put into pendants and put into other pieces of jewelry. But if you want an actually fine cut good stone, then the website that I always go to is called Gem Select. It's a very clunky, hideous looking website, but that's where I've gotten a majority of my stones, and I've always gotten very good, high quality stones from them. So Gem Select, or go for walks and just see what we can find randomly. And honestly, that's it. That's going to round out this pod class session. So hopefully you feel confident and comfortable to start silversmithing yourself. It's a fun skill that I'm grateful I developed. Even if you don't pick up silversmithing, hopefully this episode inspires you to go out and learn a different skill of your choice. If you enjoyed this episode, then please share with a friend you think would like it, or share it on social media. It would absolutely mean the world to me and helps the podcast grow so much. With all that said, thanks for listening. I greatly appreciate it. I'll talk to you all later.